6 missiles, $6 million. That is what Iran spent at 3:22 in the morning on March 13th when 6 Qatar 4 ballistic missiles struck Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates with a circular error probable of 2 to 5 meters. 7 F-35 stealth fighters from the Lightning Squadron, each valued between $80 million and $100 million, were destroyed inside hardened aircraft shelters specifically engineered to protect them from exactly this type of attack. 12 United States Air Force personnel were killed before they could reach the flight line. 19 more were wounded. Iran spent $6 million and destroyed $700 million in American air power. That is not a tactical victory. That is a strategic theorem, redrawing the map of global power in real time. And the most devastating part was not the aircraft or the casualties. It was what occurred exactly 42 minutes after the last missile impacted. At 03:22, Al Dhafra Air Base was transformed from fortress to graveyard in under 60 seconds. 6 Qatar 4 ballistic missiles, each costing roughly $1 million, tore through reinforced concrete. The shelters, advertised as proof against anything short of a nuclear strike, became tombs. 7 F-35A Lightning II stealth fighters, each valued between $80 and $100 million, were obliterated before a single engine could spool. The United States Air Force lost not just hardware, but the core of its forward air dominance in the Gulf. 12 airmen died in those shelters, caught by the overpressure and fireball before they could reach the flight line. 19 more staggered away wounded, some blinded, some burned, some deafened for life. The math was brutal. $6 million in Iranian missiles erased $700 million in American air power and took 31 skilled personnel off the board. The Qatar 4, with its composite body and maneuverable re-entry vehicle, struck with a claimed circular error probable of 2 to 5 meters. That accuracy turned hardened bunkers into liabilities. The aftermath was not just twisted metal and shattered lives. It was a message, written in craters and blood, that the calculus of power in the Middle East had changed. The base's sirens still echoed when, 42 minutes later, the next phase of the crisis began. At 4:04, less than an hour after the last missile struck Al Dhafra, the American command in the Gulf received a one-page letter from the United Arab Emirates ambassador. The language was clinical, the demand unmistakable. All U.S. military personnel and assets must begin withdrawal within 48 hours. There was no room for negotiation, no offer of mediation, no face-saving formula. The gap, just 42 minutes between devastation and diplomatic rupture, was almost without precedent. Not since 1983, when the United States pulled its Marines from Beirut after the barracks bombing, had an Arab ally delivered such an ultimatum. This was not a warning, but a decision already made. Diplomatic protocol usually moves at a glacial pace, with weeks of back-channel messaging and carefully staged press leaks. Here, the process was compressed into a single sheet of paper and a ticking clock. The shock rippled outward. Inside the U.S. Embassy, stunned officials scoured decades of cables for anything remotely similar. In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia's palace issued no statement at all. The silence from Prince Sultan Air Base was louder than any condemnation, with no solidarity, no condemnation of the attack, no commitment to continued partnership. In Doha, Qatari ministers began quietly reviewing the terms of the U.S. presence at Al Udeid, weighing the risk of becoming the next target against the promise of American protection. The loss of hardware had triggered something deeper, a crisis of confidence in the very logic of forward basing. The calculation was no longer about military deterrence, but about economic survival and political risk. If hosting U.S. forces now meant inviting missile fire, insurance hikes, and investor flight, what was left of the old bargain? The question was no longer whether the United States could defend its Gulf partners, but whether those partners could afford to keep the U.S. at all. Across the entire theater, the numbers tell a story that defies every Pentagon model. Since late February, U.S. and Israeli forces have launched strikes on more than 6,000 Iranian targets. Iranian missile and drone arsenals, once the backbone of their deterrent, have been hammered with relentless precision. CENTCOM estimates claim over 90% of Iran's ballistic missile capacity and 95% of its drone fleet have been degraded or destroyed. The Iranian Air Force and Navy are described as functionally erased, their ships sunk and their runways cratered. Official briefings cite hundreds of launchers neutralized, command nodes vaporized, and production lines shattered by Tomahawk and ATACMS salvos. On paper, this is annihilation. Yet the reality on the ground and in the air is far messier. Even with these staggering losses, Iran has managed to launch an estimated 650 ballistic missiles and 26,000 kamikaze drones since the conflict began. Analysts point to the paradox. Every wave of attrition, every intercepted drone, comes at a cost measured not just in dollars, but in operational focus and political capital. The U.S. and its partners have spent billions to intercept low-cost threats, while a handful of surviving Iranian systems have struck with disproportionate effect. The math is simple, but the consequences are not. $6 million in missiles can wipe out $700 million in aircraft. A single breach in base defenses can unravel decades of alliance building. The attrition model was supposed to guarantee victory through overwhelming firepower. Instead, it has exposed the limits of military logic in a region where strategic leverage is measured less by what is destroyed and more by what is made intolerable for America's partners. The question now is not how many drones or missiles Iran has left, but how many more blows the regional order can absorb before the cost of hosting the United States outweighs any promise of protection. $6 million in missiles, $700 million in destroyed air power. On paper, the losses are one-sided. But the real damage unfolds far from the wreckage. The attack at Al Dhafra did not just kill pilots or incinerate jets, it detonated the economic logic that underpins every U.S. base in the Gulf. For host governments, the cost-benefit equation flipped in less than an hour. The price of American protection now includes not only the risk of direct missile fire, but the secondary shockwaves that ripple through financial markets and civilian infrastructure. Insurers, watching the footage of burning aircraft shelters, began to recalculate risk models in real time. Within hours, major underwriters in London and Zurich suspended war risk coverage for assets within a 500-kilometer radius of the Gulf Coast. Oil tankers idled offshore, waiting for new terms. Commercial flights rerouted around the region, adding hours and millions in fuel costs. The Dubai International Financial Center, desalination plants in Abu Dhabi, and the sprawling Ras Laffan LNG terminal in Qatar all appeared on new target lists circulated by economic advisors, not for their military value, but for their leverage over markets. The Strait of Hormuz, already a bottleneck for a fifth of global oil, became a choke point not because of mines or blockades, but because no insurer would cover a ship transiting its waters. For 15 days, the world's most important energy corridor was, for all practical purposes, closed. Oil soared to $115 a barrel. Gulf sovereign wealth funds lost billions in a week. Qatar's ministers, facing the prospect of a single missile turning Doha into the next front page, quietly signaled that the terms of U.S. basing would have to change or end. The cost of a missile is not just measured in shrapnel and craters, but in the willingness of nations to accept exposure for the promise of partnership. When the math no longer adds up, even the strongest alliances can dissolve overnight. Within minutes of the Al Dhafra disaster, U.S. military planners unleashed a wave of kinetic countermeasures. Patriot and THAAD batteries snapped into action, launching interceptors at suspected further threats. The USS Tripoli, loaded with 2,500 Marines and F-35Bs, steamed at full speed toward the Gulf, its radar horizon sweeping for missile signatures. Army artillery units fired ATACMS missiles at Iranian launch sites, targeting mobiltels and suspected command bunkers. In the skies, B-52 bombers and U-2 reconnaissance aircraft surged forward, probing Iranian airspace and relaying real-time targeting data to Allied forces. The technical response was immediate, overwhelming, and expensive, a choreography of billion-dollar platforms, precision munitions, and round-the-clock sorties. Yet for every missile intercepted and every launcher destroyed, the gap between force and outcome widened. The arsenal was vast, the response relentless, but the calculus that mattered was shifting beyond the reach of hardware. European diplomats huddled in Brussels, sketching out a plan for multinational convoys to keep oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. The proposal was simple on paper. French, Italian, and British warships would escort tankers, while U.S. destroyers shadowed from a distance, visible but no longer the primary shield. In Riyadh, a different calculation unfolded. Policy advisors mapped out a scenario. If Prince Sultan Air Base suffered a strike like Al Dhafra, could Saudi Arabia absorb the fallout? The answer, delivered in a closed-door session, was blunt. If American protection now meant a 48-hour window to evacuate or face missile fire, the cost of alliance had become political suicide. No doctrine of deterrence, no promise of escalation dominance could guarantee that a Gulf capital would not become the next insurance exclusion zone. The central assumption that forward basing equals security was collapsing under the weight of a single unanswered question. How many more partners are willing to risk their cities, their markets, and their sovereignty for the privilege of hosting America's wars? This is not a contest of missiles versus jets, but of risk versus resolve. As host nations recalculate numbers, exposure, and political cost, the future of American power in the Gulf hinges on confidence, not firepower. The question now is, who decides what protection is worth when being protected becomes the target?